Every morning at 0500 hours, Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart through the pristine corridors of Peterson Air Force Base's most classified wing. Her weathered hands gripped the handle as wheels squeaked against polished linoleum, echoing through halls where America's most sensitive defense operations were planned and executed. To the officers hurrying past with their morning coffee and classified briefings, she was invisible, just another member of the support staff keeping their world clean and functional. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria had perfected the art of being overlooked. At 52, she stood barely 5 feet tall, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the standard-issue gray uniform of base maintenance personnel. She spoke little, smiled when spoken to, and went about her duties with the quiet efficiency that made her both essential and forgettable. The colonels and majors who passed her daily had no idea that beneath her humble exterior lay one of the most brilliant tactical minds the United States military had ever produced. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, cleaning the offices where men half her age made decisions about operations she had designed, strategies she had crafted in the shadows of Black Ops programs so classified that their existence was known only to a handful of people at the Pentagon's highest levels. But this was her life now, her carefully constructed cover that had protected both her identity and her family for the past 3 years. Her transformation from Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez, Special Operations Command's premier strategic analyst, to Maria Santos, custodial worker, had been born of necessity. 3 years ago, her work on Operation Dark Mirror had uncovered a web of corruption that reached into the highest echelons of military leadership. Her investigation had identified a network of officials selling classified information to foreign intelligence services, using their positions to compromise ongoing missions and endanger American lives overseas. The evidence she'd compiled was devastating. Financial records, intercepted communications, and documented patterns of behavior that painted a clear picture of treason. But it also painted a target on her back that made her former life impossible to maintain. The night she delivered her final report to General Patricia Hayes, her commanding officer had made it clear. Maria's life was in immediate danger, and her only chance of survival was to disappear completely. The transition hadn't been easy. Going from briefing senators and designing counterterrorism operations to mopping floors and emptying trash cans required a psychological shift that challenged every fiber of her being. She'd spent 20 years climbing the ranks, earning respect through her analytical brilliance and strategic thinking. Her work had prevented terrorist attacks, saved countless lives, and shaped American foreign policy in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Now she spent her days listening to junior officers discuss operations with the casual arrogance of those who'd never seen real combat, never had to make life-and-death decisions with incomplete information and impossible timelines. She watched them fumble through strategic assessments that she could have completed in her sleep, bite her tongue when she heard them making tactical errors that could cost lives, and maintain her cover even when every instinct screamed at her to intervene. The hardest part was the isolation. Maria had always been a people person, someone who thrived on the intellectual challenges and collaborative problem-solving that defined military strategic planning. Now she only conversed with other maintenance staff and the occasional polite nod from officers who barely acknowledged her existence. She'd traded a life of purpose and recognition for safety and anonymity, but the cost was higher than she had initially anticipated. Her small apart and off base reflected her new reality: sparse, functional, and utterly unremarkable. Gone were the commendations, the photos with high-ranking officials, and the library of strategic texts that had once defined her identity. In their place were cleaning supplies, discount furniture, and the constant awareness that her former colleagues believed her dead, killed in what was reported as a tragic car accident during a routine assignment. But Maria Santos, the janitor, was still Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez at her core. Her mind continued to analyze, to assess, and to plan. She couldn't help but notice patterns in the comings and goings of personnel, changes in security protocols, and shifts in the base's operational tempo that suggested something significant was brewing. Her training made it impossible to simply ignore the intelligence picture that was forming around her, even as she maintained her carefully constructed facade. The cleaning cart that seemed so humble was in reality her mobile intelligence platform. Hidden compartments contained encrypted communication devices, miniaturized recording equipment, and emergency extraction protocols that connected her to a network of allies who knew the truth about her situation. General Hayes checked on her monthly through coded messages, ensuring her safety while keeping her informed of the developments in the investigation that had forced her underground. As she finished cleaning the last office of the day, Maria reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She'd gone from being one of the military's most trusted strategic minds to its most invisible asset, from briefing generals to emptying their wastebaskets, from shaping policy to scrubbing floors. But she was still serving her country, still fighting the fight, just from a position no one would ever expect. The first sign that Maria's carefully maintained cover might be in jeopardy came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when Colonel James Mitchell arrived at Peterson Air Force Base with a security detail that made even seasoned officers take notice. Mitchell wasn't just any colonel. He was the Pentagon's chief of counterintelligence, a man whose reputation for uncovering security breaches and rooting out threats was legendary throughout the defense establishment. Maria was cleaning the conference room adjacent to the base commander's office when Mitchell's team began their preliminary security sweep. She kept her head down, methodically wiping tables and arranging chairs while listening to fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. They were conducting a comprehensive review of all personnel with access to classified information, implementing new biometric security measures, and, most troublingly, investigating what Mitchell called anomalous patterns in operational security. The timing couldn't have been worse. Recent months had seen a series of intelligence leaks that had compromised ongoing operations in 3 different theaters. American assets had been exposed, mission parameters had been altered midstream, and enemy forces had demonstrated knowledge of classified tactical approaches that should have been known only to the highest levels of command. Someone with extraordinary access was feeding information to hostile intelligence services, and the Pentagon was taking no chances in identifying the source. What made Maria's situation particularly precarious was her unique position within the base's ecosystem. As a custodial worker, she had access to areas and information that most personnel never saw. She cleaned offices after hours when classified materials were often left unsecured, emptied waste baskets that sometimes contained sensitive documents, and moved through restricted areas with a level of freedom that operational personnel envied. If investigators were looking for someone with the access necessary to compromise security, her profile would inevitably raise questions. The investigation intensified over the following weeks. New security protocols required all personnel to undergo enhanced background checks, submit to polygraph examinations, and provide detailed accounts of their activities and associations. Maria watched nervously as her fellow maintenance staff were called in for interviews, each returning with stories of intensive questioning about their work routines, their personal lives, and any unusual observations they'd made while performing their duties. Mitchell's team was thorough and systematic, cross-referencing personnel records with access logs, comparing duty schedules with security incidents, and building comprehensive profiles of everyone who worked in sensitive areas. They were looking for patterns, anomalies, and connections that might reveal how classified information was being extracted and transmitted. Maria knew it was only a matter of time before her turn came, and she began preparing for the confrontation that could expose everything. The irony of her situation was almost overwhelming. Here she was, one of the military's most decorated intelligence officers, living under deep cover to protect herself from the very corruption she'd exposed, now facing investigation as a potential security threat by colleagues who had no idea of her true identity or the sacrifices she'd made in service of her country. The investigation that was meant to protect American interests threatened to destroy the operation that had already saved countless lives and prevented immeasurable damage to national security. General Hayes, maintaining her role as Maria's only official contact, sent coded warnings through their established communication channels. The investigation was expanding beyond Peterson Air Force Base, encompassing multiple installations and civilian defense contractors. Mitchell's team had identified several suspects, but they were also casting a wider net, looking for patterns and anomalies that might reveal a broader conspiracy. Maria's cover identity was solid, but under the level of scrutiny now being applied, even the best constructed legends had vulnerabilities. The psychological pressure was immense. Maria had spent 3 years perfecting her role as an invisible member of the support staff, but now she felt constantly watched, constantly evaluated. Every interaction with personnel, every access to restricted areas, every routine task took on new significance as potential evidence in an investigation that could end her career, her mission, and quite possibly her life. The corruption network she'd exposed still had tentacles throughout the military hierarchy, and if her true identity was revealed, elimination would be swift and certain. Sleep became elusive as Maria ran through contingency plans and escape scenarios. Her apartment, once a refuge from the stress of maintaining her cover, now felt like a trap. She varied her routines, changed her routes to work, and began implementing counter-surveillance techniques that she hoped wouldn't be noticed by investigators who were watching for exactly those kinds of behavioral changes. The delicate balance between maintaining her cover and protecting herself from discovery required constant vigilance and flawless execution. The base itself felt different under investigation. Conversations were more guarded, personnel were suspicious of each other, and the easy camaraderie that had characterized daily operations was replaced by an atmosphere of mutual distrust. Maria watched career officers question colleagues they'd worked with for years, saw friendships strain under the pressure of security reviews, and witnessed the corrosive effect that suspicion had on military effectiveness. The investigation designed to protect national security was ironically undermining the very institutions it sought to preserve. As November progressed, Mitchell's team began focusing on specific individuals whose access patterns and behavioral profiles suggested potential security risks. Maria learned from overheard conversations that they were particularly interested in personnel whose backgrounds contained gaps or inconsistencies, anyone whose lifestyle seemed incompatible with their stated income, and individuals who had access to information that had subsequently been compromised. Each criterion brought the investigation closer to her carefully constructed identity.
The call came on a cold Thursday morning in mid-November. Maria was restocking supplies in the maintenance closet when her supervisor, Frank Rodriguez, approached with an expression that made her stomach clench. "Maria, you need to report to Building C, room 205 at 1400 hours," he said quietly, avoiding her eyes. "They want to talk to you about the security review." Building C housed the base's intelligence operations, a place where careers were made and destroyed with equal efficiency. Room 205 was Colonel Mitchell's temporary command center, where he'd been conducting his investigation into the security breaches that had compromised American operations worldwide. For Maria, walking into that room meant walking directly into the lion's den, where one wrong answer or inconsistent detail could unravel 3 years of carefully maintained deception. The hours between receiving the summons and reporting for the interview stretched like an eternity. Maria went through her daily routine with mechanical precision, cleaning offices and emptying waste baskets, while her mind raced through every aspect of her cover identity. She reviewed Maria Santos's employment history, her family background, her financial records, and her personal associations, looking for any detail that might raise suspicion or contradict the carefully constructed legend that had protected her for so long. At 13:55 hours, she stood outside room 205, her cleaning uniform replaced by the simple civilian clothes that represented her off-duty persona. The woman who entered that room was Maria Santos, a hard-working immigrant who cleaned offices to support her family, not Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez, one of the most decorated intelligence officers in United States military history. But maintaining that deception would require every ounce of training and discipline she'd accumulated over 2 decades of service. Colonel Mitchell was exactly what she'd expected. Tall, lean, with piercing gray eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for extracting truth from the most reluctant subjects. He sat behind a simple metal desk, flanked by two junior officers who served as both witnesses and note-takers. The room itself was sterile and intimidating, designed to make subjects uncomfortable and more likely to reveal information they might otherwise conceal. "Please sit down, Miss Santos," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I appreciate you taking time from your duties to speak with us. This is routine, part of our comprehensive security review, but I want to assure you that your cooperation is noted and appreciated." The questions started simply enough: basic biographical information, work history, family background. Maria answered in the slightly accented English that had become second nature, portraying the image of a hard-working woman who took pride in her job but remained intimidated by the military hierarchy. She reviewed her late husband, her children living in other states, her modest lifestyle supported by her custodial work at the base. "You've been working here for 3 years," Mitchell observed, consulting a file that Maria knew contained every detail of her fabricated background. "Your supervisor speaks highly of your work ethic and reliability. You're often here early, sometimes working late. That gives you access to areas and information that most personnel never see." The implication was clear, and Maria felt the first flutter of genuine concern. "I just try to do my job well, sir. The officers work very hard, and I want to make sure their workspace is clean and comfortable. Sometimes that means coming in early or staying late, but that's just part of being responsible." Mitchell nodded, making notes that Maria couldn't see. "During your work, have you ever noticed anything unusual? Conversations that seemed out of place, documents left unsecured, personnel behaving strangely? We're particularly interested in any observations about security protocols or handling of classified materials." This was the moment Maria had dreaded and prepared for. As a custodial worker, she would naturally notice security lapses and unusual behaviors, but demonstrating too much awareness could raise suspicions about her true background and training. She had to strike a delicate balance between appearing observant enough to be helpful and ignorant enough to maintain her cover. "Well," she said carefully, "I do notice when officers leave papers on their desks or forget to lock their computers. Sometimes I see people working very late or coming in on weekends when the building is supposed to be empty, but I always assumed that was just part of their important work. I don't read anything that's not my business, and I certainly don't understand the military things they're doing." The interview continued for over an hour, with Mitchell probing her observations about specific personnel, her knowledge of base operations, and her interactions with military staff. Each question was designed to test her story, to find inconsistencies or gaps that might reveal deception. Maria responded with the careful honesty of someone telling the truth about her fabricated life, maintaining the persona she'd perfected over 3 years of deep cover operation. But as the interview progressed, Maria began to sense that something was wrong. Mitchell's questions were too specific, too focused on details that should have been routine for a standard security review. He asked about personnel she'd barely interacted with, incidents that had occurred months ago, and operational patterns that a custodial worker shouldn't have noticed or remembered. The investigation wasn't just looking for security breaches, it was looking for her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone had connected the dots, traced the patterns, and identified Maria Santos as more than just a janitor. Whether through sophisticated analysis of her behavioral patterns, inconsistencies in her background, or intelligence from sources within the corruption network she'd exposed, her cover was compromised. The question now wasn't whether she'd been discovered, but how much they knew and what they planned to do about it.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The interview concluded with Mitchell's standard warnings about maintaining confidentiality and cooperation, but Maria could feel his eyes following her as she left room 205. Something in his demeanor had shifted during their conversation, a subtle change that her trained instincts recognized as the moment when a hunter catches the scent of his prey. She maintained her humble posture and shuffled gait until she was out of sight, but her mind was racing through emergency protocols and escape scenarios that hadn't been activated in 3 years. Back in the maintenance closet, Maria's hands shook slightly as she sorted cleaning supplies, the mundane task providing cover while she processed the implications of what had just occurred. The questions Mitchell had asked weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested someone had been analyzing her movements, her access patterns, and her interactions with base personnel. Whoever was feeding information to the investigation had done their homework, and Maria's carefully constructed cover was beginning to crack under scrutiny. The real danger became apparent 2 days later when Captain Sarah Chen, one of the junior officers she'd occasionally observed during her cleaning rounds, approached her in the corridor outside the classified briefing rooms. Chen was known for her sharp analytical mind and her work in counterintelligence operations, but what made Maria's blood freeze was the look of recognition in her eyes. "Excuse me, Maria," Chen said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that suggested this wasn't a casual encounter. "I've been thinking about something since Colonel Mitchell's investigation began, and I was wondering if we could talk privately. There's something about you that seems familiar." Maria's training kicked in automatically, her face maintaining the polite confusion of a custodial worker being addressed by a superior officer. "I'm sorry, Captain, but I don't understand. Have I done something wrong with my cleaning? If there's a problem with my work—" "No, your work is fine," Chen interrupted, her eyes never leaving Maria's face. "It's something else. Your posture, the way you move, the way you observe things. I've been in military intelligence for 8 years, and I've learned to notice patterns that others miss. There's something about you that doesn't match your file." The conversation was taking place in a public corridor, but Maria felt as exposed as if she were standing naked in Times Square. Chen's suspicions, if voiced to Colonel Mitchell, could trigger a level of investigation that no cover identity could withstand. The biometric scans, DNA analysis, and deep background checks that would follow would inevitably reveal her true identity, ending not just her operation, but potentially her life. "Captain," Maria said, choosing her words with extreme care, "I think your imagination might be getting the better of you. I'm just a cleaning lady. I've never been in the military or anything like that. Maybe you're thinking of someone else?" Chen stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "3 weeks ago, I watched you clean the strategic planning office. While you were emptying wastebaskets, there was a security alert. Someone tried to access a classified server from an unauthorized terminal. The moment the alarm sounded, you immediately looked toward the server room, not toward the nearest exit like everyone else would. You looked toward the source of the security breach like someone with tactical training would." Maria's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized how careful observation and analytical thinking had compromised what should have been an impenetrable cover. Chen had noticed a behavioral pattern that revealed her true background, the kind of small but telling detail that separated professional intelligence operatives from civilian personnel. It was exactly the type of observation that Maria herself would have made when identifying potential security threats and intelligence assets. And she recognized the methodical approach of a trained investigator closing in on the truth. "Maybe," Chen replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. "Or maybe you're someone with enough security training to immediately identify the source of a breach. Someone whose first instinct is to assess the tactical situation rather than seek personal safety. That's not the reaction of a civilian custodial worker, Maria. That's the reaction of someone with extensive military training." The standoff stretched for several seconds, both women understanding the implications of what was being discussed. Chen had identified an inconsistency that could unravel everything, while Maria faced the impossible choice between maintaining her cover and protecting her mission. Any admission of her true identity would not only end her operation, but potentially expose her to the same corruption network that had forced her underground in the first place. "Captain," Maria said,
choosing her words with extreme care. "I think your imagination might be getting the better of you. I'm just a woman trying to do her job and support her family. If my reactions to emergency situations seem unusual, maybe that's because I've had to deal with difficult situations in my personal life. But I can assure you, I've never had any military training or security experience." Chen studied her for a long moment, and Maria could see the wheels turning behind her intelligent eyes. The captain was weighing evidence, assessing probabilities, and trying to reconcile what she'd observed with what she'd been told. It was exactly the type of analytical process that Maria herself would have used to identify security threats and intelligence assets. And she recognized the methodical approach of a trained investigator closing in on the truth. "We'll see," Chen said eventually, stepping back and resuming her normal tone. "I'm sure Colonel Mitchell would be interested in discussing these observations during his investigation. Have a good day, Maria." As Chen walked away, Maria felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. The investigation was no longer just looking for security breaches, it was specifically looking for her. Someone had connected enough dots to identify her as a person of interest, and now, trained intelligence officers were actively working to uncover her true identity. The question was no longer whether her cover would be blown, but how much time she had before the inevitable exposure occurred.
That evening, Maria sat in her modest apartment, staring at the encrypted communication device that represented her only lifeline to General Hayes and the network of allies who knew the truth about her situation. For the first time in 3 years, she seriously considered activating the emergency extraction protocol that would pull her out of her assignment and relocate her to a new identity in a different part of the country. But extraction would mean abandoning the mission that had already cost her so much, and it would leave the corruption network she'd exposed free to continue their operations against American interests. The secure phone buzzed with an incoming message, displaying the coded sequence that indicated urgent communication from General Hayes. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she activated the decryption sequence, revealing a message that confirmed her worst fears. "Investigation focused on your location. Multiple personnel expressing suspicions. Recommend immediate extraction. Awaiting your response." But before she could formulate a reply, another message appeared, this one containing intelligence that made her blood run cold. "Corruption network planning major operation. Classified weapons shipment scheduled for diversion next week. Your position may be only chance to prevent catastrophic security breach." Maria stared at the screen, understanding that she was facing the most difficult decision of her career. The corruption network she'd spent years investigating was apparently planning something significant, an operation that could compromise American military capabilities on a scale that dwarfed their previous activities. As the only intelligence asset in position to observe and potentially prevent this breach, her extraction would leave the country vulnerable to an attack that could cost thousands of lives. The next morning brought new pressures as Colonel Mitchell's investigation intensified. Security personnel began conducting random searches of lockers and personal belongings, installing additional surveillance cameras in sensitive areas, and implementing new protocols that required all personnel to account for their movements and activities in unprecedented detail. Maria watched these developments with growing concern, recognizing the systematic approach of investigators who were closing in on their target. The breaking point came during her afternoon cleaning rounds when she encountered Major David Walsh, the base operations officer, having an animated conversation with someone on his secure phone. Walsh had been one of the officers she'd been observing, someone whose financial lifestyle seemed inconsistent with his military salary, and whose access to classified shipment schedules made him a prime suspect in her ongoing investigation of the corruption network. "The timeline is moving up," Walsh was saying, apparently believing he was alone in his office. "We need to coordinate the diversion for this weekend instead of next week. The increased security is making our normal contacts nervous, and we can't afford any delays that might compromise the entire operation." Maria continued her cleaning routine, emptying wastebaskets and dusting surfaces while listening to what was clearly a planning session for the major security breach that General Hayes had warned her about. Walsh was coordinating with external contacts to divert a classified weapons shipment, using his position to provide intelligence about security protocols and transportation schedules. This was exactly the type of operation she'd been positioned to prevent, but stopping it would require breaking her cover and revealing her true identity. The custodial staff has been asking too many questions, Walsh continued, and Maria felt her blood freeze as she realized he was talking about the investigation into her activities. That Mexican cleaning lady has been working strange hours, and some of the officers think she might be more than she appears. We need to accelerate our timeline before the counterintelligence people figure out what's really going on. The irony was staggering. The very corruption network she'd been investigating was now suspicious of her investigation, creating a circular pattern of surveillance and counter-surveillance that threatened to expose everyone involved. Walsh and his conspirators were planning to accelerate their operation partly because they suspected her of being more than a custodial worker, while Colonel Mitchell's investigation was closing in on her because her behavioral patterns suggested she was more than a civilian employee. Maria finished her cleaning and left Walsh's office, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. The corruption network was planning a major operation for the weekend, just 3 days away. Mitchell's investigation was focusing increasingly on her activities and background. Captain Chen had already identified behavioral inconsistencies that suggested military training. The window for maintaining her cover while accomplishing her mission was rapidly closing. That evening, she composed a carefully worded message to General Hayes, outlining the situation and requesting immediate guidance. The response came within hours. Prevent the breach at all costs. Authorization granted for cover termination if necessary. Extraction team on standby. The message represented both permission and condemnation. Maria was authorized to break her cover if necessary to prevent the weapons diversion, but doing so would end her ability to investigate the corruption network from within. She would have one chance to stop the immediate threat, but the broader conspiracy would likely disappear back into the shadows, leaving the military vulnerable to future attacks and compromising the years of work she had invested in mapping their operations. As she prepared for what might be her final weekend as Maria Santos, custodial worker, Maria reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. From decorated intelligence officer to invisible janitor to the center of a counterintelligence investigation that threatened to expose both her identity and the corruption she had been fighting, her life had become a complex web of deception and dedication that was finally approaching its climax. The question now wasn't whether she'd have to reveal her true identity, but whether she could do so in a way that would stop the immediate threat while preserving enough of her operation to continue the fight against the conspiracy that had cost her everything she once held dear.
Friday afternoon brought the news that Maria had been dreading. Colonel Mitchell had scheduled another interview for Monday morning, this one designated as a comprehensive security review that would include polygraph testing, enhanced background verification, and what the notice euphemistically called additional investigative procedures. Maria knew exactly what those procedures would entail. Biometric analysis that would identify her true identity within hours, ending both her mission and quite possibly her life. The timing couldn't have been more challenging. Walsh's conversation had confirmed that the weapons diversion was scheduled for Saturday night, when reduced weekend staffing would provide cover for the operation. Maria had less than 24 hours to gather the evidence needed to stop the breach, coordinate with General Hayes to ensure the appropriate response, and somehow manage to do so without completely destroying the cover that had protected her for 3 years. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As she was finishing her Friday evening cleaning rounds, Maria noticed unusual activity in the secure loading area where classified materials were typically handled. Personnel who normally wouldn't be working weekend shifts were present, coordinating with civilian contractors who had no apparent authorization to be in restricted areas. Walsh was supervising the operations personally, using his authority to wave through security checks that should have been mandatory for any movement of sensitive materials. Maria positioned herself in a maintenance closet adjacent to the loading dock, using equipment hidden in her cleaning cart to document the operation unfolding before her. The level of coordination and preparation suggested this wasn't an opportunistic theft, but rather a carefully planned operation that had been months in the making. Walsh was working with at least 6 other individuals, including 2 senior NCOs and a civilian contractor who appeared to be coordinating transportation logistics. The weapons being prepared for routine transfer were state-of-the-art anti-aircraft missiles, the kind of advanced technology that could shift the balance of power in regional conflicts if they fell into the wrong hands. The paperwork Walsh was signing indicated they were being moved to a secure storage facility in Colorado, but Maria could tell from the coordination activities that the actual destination was quite different. As she documented the operation, Maria realized that she was witnessing something far more significant than a simple corruption scheme. This was coordinated espionage at the highest levels, an operation that had infiltrated multiple bases and involved personnel with the highest security clearances. The weapons being stolen represented millions of dollars in advanced technology and the potential to compromise American military operations worldwide. The breaking point came when Maria observed Walsh making a phone call to confirm pickup arrangements. "The packages will be ready for collection at 0200 hours, he said, using terminology that made it clear he wasn't talking to legitimate military personnel. "Our contact will provide the alternate transportation manifest, and the original documentation will show routine transfer completion. By the time anyone realizes what happened, the materials will be beyond recovery." Maria had heard enough. The operation was scheduled for Saturday night, which meant she had less than 12 hours to coordinate a response that would prevent the theft while gathering enough evidence to expose the entire network. But stopping the operation would require resources and authority that Maria Santos, custodial worker, simply didn't possess. It would require Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez to emerge from hiding and reclaim her position as one of the military's premier intelligence operatives. She retreated to her apartment and activated the emergency communication protocol for the first time in 3 years. Within minutes, she was connected to General Hayes through an encrypted channel that bypassed all standard military communication networks. "Maria, thank God you're safe," Hayes said, her relief evident even through the digital encryption. "We've been monitoring the investigation, and we know your cover is compromised. Mitchell's team has identified enough inconsistencies to justify a full identity verification, which means you have hours, not days, before everything unravels." "General, the weapons diversion is happening tonight. Walsh and his network are stealing advanced anti-aircraft missiles with the cooperation of base personnel. If we don't stop them now, these weapons could end up in the hands of terrorist organizations or hostile nations. But stopping them will require revealing my identity and position." Hayes was quiet for several seconds, and Maria could imagine her weighing the implications of exposing an asset that had already sacrificed so much for the mission. "Do you have enough evidence to prove the corruption network extends beyond this single operation?" "Yes, ma'am. 3 years of documentation, financial records, communication intercepts, and behavioral analysis. But if I reveal myself to stop tonight's operation, the network will know they've been compromised and disappear before we can arrest the higher-level conspirators." "Understood. Here's what we're going to do. I'm activating a special operations team that will be on site within 2 hours. You'll coordinate their response to the weapons theft using your knowledge of base operations and personnel involved. Once we've secured the evidence and arrested the immediate conspirators, we'll extract you before Mitchell's investigation can compromise your safety." Maria felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she realized her time as Maria Santos was finally ending. The humble janitor who had cleaned offices and emptied wastebaskets was about to disappear, replaced by the intelligence officer who had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. But the transition would come at a cost: the end of her ability to investigate the corruption network from within, and the loss of the anonymity that had kept her alive. "General, there's one more thing. Captain Chen has identified behavioral patterns that suggest I have military training. She's planning to brief Colonel Mitchell on Monday. Even if we stop tonight's operation successfully, my cover will be blown within days. Then we'll make sure those days count, Maria. It's time to come home.
Saturday evening at Peterson Air Force Base carried an unusual tension that Maria felt in every fiber of her being. As she made her final rounds as Maria Santos, custodial worker, she moved through familiar corridors with the knowledge that by dawn, either she would have helped prevent one of the most significant security breaches in military history, or the weapons diversion would succeed, and her 3 years of sacrifice would have been for nothing. General Hayes' Special Operations Team had arrived under cover of a routine training exercise, their presence explained by official orders that required no questions from base personnel. Led by Major Patricia Hendricks, a woman whose reputation in special operations rivaled Maria's own legendary status in intelligence analysis, the team consisted of 8 highly trained operatives who specialized in counter-espionage and asset recovery operations. At 2100 hours, Maria met with Major Hendricks in a secure location off base, finally abandoning the hunched posture and subservient demeanor that had defined her existence for 3 years. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the invisible janitor, replaced by the sharp-eyed intelligence officer whose analytical mind had once shaped American defense policy. "Colonel Santos Ramirez," Hendricks said, using Maria's real rank for the first time in years, "General Hayes has briefed me on your situation and the intelligence you've gathered. What can you tell me about tonight's operation?" Maria spread out hand-drawn schematics of the base layout, annotated with 3 years of observations about security protocols, personnel patterns, and operational vulnerabilities. Walsh and his team planned to move the missiles through loading docks C at approximately 0200 hours. They've arranged for reduced security staffing and coordinated with external contractors who will provide alternative transportation. The original manifests will show routine transfer completion, making it appear the weapons reached their intended destination. "How many conspirators are we looking at?" Hendricks asked, studying the detailed intelligence package that represented years of careful observation and analysis. "At least 8 personnel on base, including Walsh, 2 senior NCOs, and 5 support staff who provide access and logistics coordination. External contacts include civilian contractors and what I believe are foreign intelligence operatives who coordinate final disposition of stolen materials. This isn't their first operation. I've documented at least 12 previous thefts over the past 18 months. Hendricks nodded grimly. "General Hayes wants this entire network rolled up, not just tonight's operation stopped. Can you identify the external contacts and their coordination methods?" "Yes, ma'am. Walsh uses encrypted communication devices that aren't part of standard military equipment, and he coordinates pickup operations through a civilian logistics company that appears to be a front for foreign intelligence services. I have communication intercepts, financial records, and behavioral analysis that maps the entire network structure." The briefing continued for 2 hours, with Maria providing detailed intelligence about each conspirator's role, their security vulnerabilities, and the operational timeline that would allow Hendricks' team to intercept the theft while gathering maximum evidence. It felt surreal to be functioning again as a senior intelligence officer, using skills and knowledge that had been carefully hidden for so long. "There's one complication," Maria said, as the briefing concluded. "Colonel Mitchell's investigation has identified me as a person of interest. Captain Chen suspects I have military training, and I'm scheduled for comprehensive security review Monday morning. Even if we succeed tonight, my cover will be blown within 48 hours. General Hayes anticipated that. "Once we complete tonight's operation, you'll be extracted and relocated with a new identity. Your work here is done, Colonel. You've provided intelligence that will prevent a catastrophic security breach and expose a corruption network that threatened national security." As they prepared to return to base, Maria felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that her long isolation was ending, pride that her sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose, and sadness that the humble janitor who had become her identity was about to disappear forever. Maria Santos had been more than a cover. She had been a life, complete with its own relationships, routines, and quiet satisfactions. At 23:30 hours, Maria resumed her position on base, ostensibly completing her weekend cleaning duties, while actually coordinating the most complex counter-espionage operation of her career. Hendrix's team was positioned throughout the facility, invisible, but ready to move when the weapons theft began. Every communication was monitored, every movement tracked, every contingency planned for. The waiting was the hardest part. Maria moved through corridors she'd cleaned for 3 years, past offices where she'd observed the daily operations of personnel who had no idea that the quiet woman emptying their wastebaskets was actually one of the most decorated intelligence officers in military history. In a few hours, some of these same people would learn that their trusted colleague, Major Walsh, was actually a traitor who had been selling American military secrets to foreign enemies. At 01:30 hours, unusual activity began around loading dock C. Personnel who shouldn't have been on base appeared at security checkpoints with authorization that Walsh had provided through his position as operations officer. Civilian contractors arrived with transportation vehicles that bore official military markings but were actually part of the theft operation. The level of coordination and preparation confirmed that this was a sophisticated espionage operation, not a simple corruption scheme. Maria positioned herself where she could observe the loading operations while maintaining communication with Hendrix's team. Through her hidden equipment, she transmitted real-time intelligence about personnel positions, security vulnerabilities, and operational timing that would allow the special operations team to move at exactly the right moment. "Eagle 1, this is oversight," she whispered into her concealed microphone, using the call signs that had been established for the operation. 8 personnel now active in the loading area. Civilian vehicles in position. Walsh is coordinating final security sweeps. Estimate 15 minutes until material movement begins. Copy, oversight. All units in position. Remember, we need them to actually begin moving the materials before we can arrest them for theft. Let them load the first container before we move. Maria watched Walsh supervising the careful loading of missile components into containers that bore official military seals but would never reach their intended destination. The weapons being stolen represented not just millions of dollars in advanced technology, but years of research and development that had given American forces critical advantages in combat situations worldwide.
At 0147 hours, the first container of stolen missiles was loaded onto the civilian truck, and Major Hendrix gave the order that Maria had been waiting 3 years to hear. All units, execute. Repeat, all units, execute. The coordinated assault was a masterpiece of tactical precision. Special operations personnel emerged from concealed positions throughout the loading area, surrounding the conspirators before they could react or destroy evidence. Walsh reached for his sidearm, but found himself facing 3 operatives with automatic weapons who were far better trained and infinitely more prepared for combat. "Major Walsh, you are under arrest for conspiracy, theft of classified materials, and treason," Hendrix announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had conducted dozens of similar operations. "All personnel in the loading area, place your hands where we can see them and move away from the vehicles." Maria watched from her concealed position as the conspiracy she'd spent 3 years investigating finally collapsed. The evidence being gathered would expose not just this single theft, but the entire network of corruption that had compromised American military security. Financial records, communication intercepts, and documented patterns of behavior would provide prosecutors with everything needed to dismantle the espionage operation completely. But the night's work was far from over. As Hendrix's team secured the immediate area and began processing the arrested conspirators, Maria's attention was drawn to unusual activity in other parts of the base. Her hidden monitoring equipment was detecting encrypted communications from personnel who shouldn't have been active at this hour, suggesting that the conspiracy had backup plans and alternative operations ready to implement. "Major Hendrix," she radioed urgently, "I'm detecting communications from Building F and the Communication Center. This operation may have triggered contingency protocols from other members of the network."
The response confirmed Maria's worst fears. The arrest of Walsh and his immediate team had activated emergency procedures designed to protect the broader conspiracy. Personnel in other locations were destroying evidence, activating communication protocols with external contacts, and potentially preparing to eliminate anyone who could expose their activities. "Colonel Santos Ramirez," Hendricks radioed back, "we need your intelligence analysis capabilities right now. Can you identify other personnel who might be part of the network?" Maria's mind raced through 3 years of observations, connecting patterns and behaviors that suddenly took on new significance. Building F houses the Communications Security Office. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes has access to encryption protocols and communication monitoring capabilities. If he's part of the network, he could be warning external contacts about tonight's arrests. And the Communications Center? Captain Rodriguez has been working unusual hours and has access to outgoing communication logs. If the network has been monitoring investigation progress, Rodriguez would be in position to provide that intelligence. Hendricks made the tactical decision that would define the rest of the operation. "We're expanding the arrests. Alpha Team will take Building F. Beta Team will secure the communication center. Oversight, I need you to coordinate from your current position and provide real-time intelligence about any other suspicious activity." Maria felt the familiar rush of operational command as she coordinated multiple tactical teams from her position in the shadows. Using skills honed over 2 decades of intelligence operations, she directed personnel movements, identified potential security threats, and provided the analytical support that allowed Hendricks' operatives to move with surgical precision through the base's complex layout. The expansion of the operation revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Maria had been investigating. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was indeed coordinating with external contacts, attempting to warn foreign intelligence operatives about the arrests and arrange emergency extraction procedures. Captain Rodriguez had been monitoring Colonel Mitchell's counterintelligence investigation, providing the corruption network with detailed intelligence about which personnel were under suspicion and what evidence had been gathered. But the most shocking discovery came when Barnes, faced with inevitable arrest, began revealing information in an attempt to negotiate a reduced sentence. "You have no idea how deep this goes," he told Hendricks during his initial interrogation. "The network extends to the Pentagon, to congressional staff members, to defense contractors at the highest levels. Walsh was just middle management in an operation that has been compromising American security for over a decade." Maria listened to Barnes's revelations with a mixture of vindication and horror. Her 3 years of sacrifice had indeed been necessary. The corruption network was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, with tentacles reaching into every aspect of American defense operations. The intelligence she had gathered from her invisible position as a janitor had provided the foundation for exposing a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of national security. As dawn approached, the scope of the night's arrests continued to expand. Hendricks' team had detained 12 base personnel, identified external contacts in 3 countries, and gathered evidence that would support prosecution of defense contractors and civilian officials who had facilitated the espionage operations. The weapons theft that had triggered the operation was revealed to be just one small part of a massive intelligence-gathering effort that had been stealing American military secrets for years. "Colonel Santos Ramirez," Hendricks radioed, as the immediate tactical operations concluded. "General Hayes is requesting immediate debrief. The intelligence you've provided has exposed the largest espionage network we have encountered since the Cold War. Your mission here is complete." Maria felt a profound sense of completion as she prepared to abandon her position in the shadows and reclaim her identity as a senior intelligence officer. The humble janitor, who had cleaned offices and emptied wastebaskets, was about to disappear, but her legacy would be the exposure of a conspiracy that threatened American lives and national security on an unprecedented scale. But even as she prepared for extraction, her trained instincts detected one final threat that would test everything she'd learned during her 3 years of invisible service.
As Maria prepared to abandon her concealed position and join Hendrick's team for extraction, her monitoring equipment detected an encrypted transmission from an unexpected source, Colonel Mitchell himself. The man who had been investigating her activities as a potential security threat was now communicating with someone using the same encryption protocols that the corruption network had employed. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Mitchell's investigation hadn't been designed to identify security threats, but to identify her specifically. Someone within the network had recognized that Maria Santos was more than a simple custodial worker, and Mitchell had been brought in to confirm their suspicions and eliminate the threat she represented. "Major Hendricks," she radioed urgently, "Colonel Mitchell is compromised. Repeat, the investigation leader is part of the network. He's communicating with external contacts right now, probably arranging for cleanup operations to eliminate witnesses and evidence." The response crackled back immediately. "Are you certain? Mitchell has Pentagon authorization and full security clearance for his investigation." "Positive identification. He's using the same encryption protocols that Walsh and Barnes used to coordinate with foreign contacts. The entire investigation may have been designed to identify and eliminate me before I could expose the full scope of the conspiracy." Maria's analysis of the situation revealed the terrifying sophistication of the network she'd been fighting. They had identified her as a threat, but instead of simply eliminating her, they had arranged for an official Pentagon investigation that would provide legal justification for her arrest or termination. Mitchell's security review would have concluded that Maria Santos was actually a foreign intelligence operative, justifying whatever measures were necessary to neutralize the threat she represented. "We need to arrest Mitchell before he can implement whatever contingency plans the network has prepared," Maria continued. "But be aware that he has Pentagon authorization and backup from Washington. Taking him into custody will require General Hayes to provide political cover at the highest levels." Hendricks's voice carried the tension of a commander who had just realized her operation was far more complex than originally planned. "Colonel, Mitchell is currently in Building A with his investigation team and full security detail. If he's part of the network, those personnel may also be compromised. We could be looking at a significant firefight in the middle of an active military base." Maria's mind raced through tactical options, considering the political implications of arresting a Pentagon-authorized investigator alongside the immediate security threats his continued freedom represented. "Major, I recommend a different approach. Let me approach Mitchell directly, using my cover identity as bait. If he's part of the network, he'll attempt to eliminate me personally rather than risk exposure through official channels. We can record his attempt and gather evidence that will support his arrest." "Absolutely not, Colonel. You've been under deep cover for 3 years, and your extraction is authorized. I will not risk your life to gather evidence against a single conspirator, even one at Mitchell's level." But Maria had already made her decision. The network she'd spent 3 years investigating was making one final attempt to eliminate her and cover their tracks. Every instinct developed over 2 decades of intelligence operations told her that this was her moment to end the threat permanently, not just for herself, but for every American service member whose safety depended on exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. "Major, I'm going to approach Mitchell's location. If he's innocent, I'll identify myself and request protective custody pending investigation. If he's part of the network, his reaction will provide all the evidence we need. Either way, this ends tonight." Without waiting for Hendricks's response, Maria began moving toward Building A, abandoning the custodial equipment that had been her cover for 3 years, and drawing on skills that had made her one of the military's most effective intelligence operatives. She moved through familiar corridors with new purpose, no longer the invisible janitor, but the hunter closing in on her prey. Building A was quiet at 0300 hours, with only Mitchell's investigation team supposedly present for what he had described as overnight analysis of security data. But Maria's approach revealed additional personnel who had no official reason to be present, including civilians who appeared to be coordinating with Mitchell rather than supporting his official investigation.
She positioned herself outside Mitchell's temporary command center, using skills perfected during covert operations in hostile territory to observe and analyze the situation. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions. Mitchell was coordinating a cleanup operation designed to eliminate evidence and witnesses, starting with her own termination. The janitor has been identified as Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez. She's been conducting unauthorized intelligence operations for 3 years, compromising security and endangering personnel. Our orders are to arrest her immediately and transfer her to secure custody for interrogation. Maria listened as Mitchell continued outlining plans that would result in her disappearance, officially explained as the arrest of a security threat, but actually representing elimination by the same network she'd spent 3 years investigating. The irony was complete. The corruption network had arranged for an official Pentagon investigation to provide legal cover for murdering the intelligence officer who had exposed their activities. Drawing on courage developed through years of dangerous operations, Maria stepped into the doorway of Mitchell's command center, abandoning her cover completely and confronting the conspiracy that had cost her everything she had once held dear. "Colonel Mitchell," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of her real rank and identity. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez, and you are under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and attempted murder of a federal officer."
The silence that followed Maria's announcement stretched for several seconds as Mitchell and his team processed the shock of seeing their target voluntarily surrender her cover and challenge them directly. Mitchell's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally the cold calculation of someone who had been caught but wasn't ready to surrender. "Colonel Santos Ramirez," Mitchell said with false calm, his hand moving slowly toward his sidearm, "you are under arrest for conducting unauthorized intelligence operations, compromising national security, and operating under false identity. Surrender immediately and you will be treated according to military justice protocols." Maria remained perfectly still, knowing that Hendrix's team was positioning themselves around the building, but aware that any sudden movement could trigger a firefight that would endanger everyone involved. "Colonel Mitchell, I am operating under direct authorization from General Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Intelligence Division. You and your team are the ones operating outside legal authority, coordinating with foreign intelligence services to steal classified materials and eliminate American intelligence assets." The standoff was broken when Captain Chen appeared in the doorway behind Maria, her expression showing the shock of someone whose suspicions had been dramatically confirmed. "Colonel Mitchell, what's going on here? Why is the custodial worker claiming to be a lieutenant colonel?" Mitchell's reaction revealed everything. Instead of explaining the situation or maintaining his cover as a legitimate investigator, he drew his weapon and pointed it at Maria. "Captain Chen, step back immediately. This woman is a foreign intelligence operative who has been conducting espionage operations on this base for 3 years. But Chen's intelligence training allowed her to read the tactical situation correctly. "Sir, if she's really a foreign operative, why would she voluntarily reveal herself and challenge you directly? And why are you drawing a weapon on someone who appears to be surrendering?" Maria seized the moment of confusion to provide the explanation that would save all their lives. "Colonel Chen, 3 years ago, I was Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez, Special Operations Command Strategic Analyst. I was placed under deep cover to investigate a corruption network that was stealing classified materials and selling them to foreign intelligence services. Colonel Mitchell is part of that network, and his investigation was designed to identify and eliminate me before I could expose their activities." Chen's intellectual mind processed this information with the speed that had made her an effective intelligence officer. "The behavioral patterns I observed, your tactical awareness, your reaction to security alerts, your knowledge of base operations. You weren't acting like a civilian because you aren't a civilian." "That's correct, Captain. And right now, Major Hendrix's team and her Special Operations team are positioned throughout this building, ready to arrest Colonel Mitchell and anyone who supports his illegal activities."
Mitchell's desperation became apparent as he realized his situation was hopeless. "You have no proof of anything. My investigation has full Pentagon authorization, and my orders come directly from Washington. Even if you are who you claim to be, I'm operating under legitimate authority." Maria smiled for the first time in 3 years with genuine satisfaction. "Colonel, for the past 4 hours, every communication you have made has been monitored and recorded by Major Hendrix's team. We have documented evidence of your coordination with the same foreign contacts that Walsh and Barnes were working with. Your encryption protocols, your communication patterns, and your coordination of cleanup operations have all been recorded." The confession came not from Mitchell, but from one of his team members, who had apparently decided to cooperation offered better prospects than continued resistance. Sergeant Williams, one of Mitchell's supposed investigation assistants, suddenly stepped away from his colleagues and addressed Maria directly. "Colonel Santos Ramirez, I was ordered to participate in this operation under the belief that you were actually a security threat. I had no knowledge of any conspiracy or foreign intelligence connections. If Colonel Mitchell has been lying to us about the nature of this investigation, I want to cooperate fully with legitimate authorities." Williams' defection triggered the collapse of Mitchell's entire operation. Within minutes, Hendrix's team had secured the building, arrested Mitchell and 2 of his civilian contractors, and begun processing evidence that would complete the destruction of the corruption network that had threatened American security for over a decade. As dawn broke over Peterson Air Force Base, Maria finally allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The humble janitor who cleaned offices and emptied wastebaskets was gone forever, but her sacrifice had achieved something remarkable: the exposure and destruction of the most sophisticated espionage network that American counterintelligence had encountered in decades. General Hayes arrived by helicopter as the final arrests were being processed, embracing Maria with the emotion of a commander who had sent one of her best officers into extreme danger and witnessed her emerge victorious. "Colonel Santos Ramirez, your sacrifice and dedication have prevented catastrophic damage to American security interests. The intelligence you gathered during 3 years of deep cover operations have provided the foundation for prosecuting not just the personnel arrested tonight, but dozens of conspirators throughout the defense establishment." Maria looked around the base that had been her home and her mission for 3 years, saying goodbye to the invisible life that had defined her existence since her supposed death. The corridors she had cleaned, the offices she had maintained, the personnel she had observed, all of it would soon be part of her past as she returned her real identity and the recognition she had earned through extraordinary service. "General, what happens to Maria Santos?" she asked quietly. "Maria Santos died tonight, Colonel. She died a hero, having served her country in a way that few people will ever understand or appreciate. But her sacrifice will be remembered by everyone's life was saved by the intelligence she provided."
6 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Elena Santos Ramirez stood before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, delivering testimony about Operation Silent Guardian, the code name that had been assigned to her 3-year deep cover mission. The senators listened with rapt attention as she described the complexity of the corruption network she had exposed, the sophistication of their operations, and the devastating impact their activities had on American military effectiveness. The statistics were staggering. The network she had infiltrated and exposed had been responsible for stealing classified technology worth over $2 billion, compromising active operations in 12 countries, and directly contributing to the deaths of 17 American service members whose missions had been betrayed by sold intelligence. The evidence she had gathered during her time as Maria Santos had led to the arrest and prosecution of 43 individuals, including senior Pentagon officials, defense contractors, and foreign intelligence operatives. Colonel Santos Ramirez, Senator Patricia Williams, asked during the classified briefing, "What was the most challenging aspect of maintaining your cover identity for 3 years?" Maria considered the question carefully, thinking about the isolation, the loss of identity, and the psychological toll of living as someone she wasn't. Senator. The most difficult aspect wasn't the physical challenges or even the danger of discovery. It was watching good people, dedicated service members, make decisions based on compromised intelligence, knowing that I had information that could help them, but being unable to act without destroying the mission that would ultimately save many more lives. The committee's final report, heavily classified and limited to the highest levels of government, would describe Operation Silent Guardian as one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in American history. But for Maria, the true measure of success wasn't found in statistics or commendations. It was in the knowledge that the corruption network that had threatened American lives had been completely dismantled. Her return to active duty had been challenging in unexpected ways. After 3 years of invisibility, the transition back to a position of authority and recognition required psychological adjustment that military counselors were still helping her navigate. The skills she had used as Maria Santos, observation without engagement, analysis without action, patience without immediate gratification, had to be carefully balanced with the leadership and decision-making abilities that defined her real identity. General Hayes had offered her any assignment she wanted, recognizing that her unique experience made her invaluable for a variety of specialized roles. Maria had chosen to return to the Pentagon, where she now headed a new counterintelligence division specifically focused on insider threats and long-term infiltration operations. Her experience as the target of investigation, while simultaneously conducting investigation, had given her insights that no classroom training could provide. The personal cost of her mission remained significant. The 3 years of isolation had changed her in ways that she was still discovering. Relationships that had existed before her supposed death had been irretrievably lost, and building new connections required learning to trust again after years of maintaining deceptive cover stories. The simple act of introducing herself by her real name sometimes still felt strange after so long as Maria Santos. But there were unexpected rewards as well. Captain Chen, whose analytical skills had first identified Maria's military background, had requested transfer to Maria's new division. The two had developed a professional partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills that made their counterintelligence team one of the most effective in the Pentagon. Chen often joked that having a boss who had once been investigated by her own unit created a unique dynamic that kept everyone sharp. The broader impact of Operation Silent Guardian extended far beyond the specific network that Maria had exposed. Her success had led to comprehensive reviews of security protocols at military installations worldwide, new procedures for background investigations, and enhanced training for personnel responsible for identifying insider threats. The methods she had developed for conducting long-term observation while maintaining operational security had become standard curriculum at intelligence training facilities. Major Hendricks, who had led the tactical operation that ended Maria's cover assignment, had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and now worked closely with Maria on developing techniques for extracting assets from long-term deep cover operations. Their collaboration had produced new protocols that would protect future operatives who found themselves in similarly dangerous and isolated situations. The corruption network's attempts to eliminate Maria had ultimately led to their own destruction, but the investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in American security that required ongoing attention. Maria's new division was tasked with identifying and monitoring potential insider threats before they could develop into the kind of sophisticated network that had nearly succeeded in compromising American military effectiveness on a global scale. On quiet evenings in her Pentagon office, Maria sometimes reflected on the strange journey that had taken her from decorated intelligence officer to invisible janitor and back again. The woman who had once cleaned offices and emptied wastebaskets in anonymity now briefed cabinet members and shaped national security policy. But the lessons learned during those 3 years of invisibility continued to influence every decision she made. The most important lesson was the recognition that true service sometimes required complete sacrifice of recognition and acknowledgement. Maria Santos, the humble custodial worker, would never receive medals or commendations, would never be acknowledged in official histories, and would never be remembered by the people whose lives she had helped to save. But her invisible service had been no less valuable than the highly visible leadership that Maria Elena Santos Ramirez now provided. As she reviewed intelligence reports and planned operations that would protect American interests around the world, Maria carried with her the perspective of someone who had seen service from both sides, the recognized and the invisible, the acknowledged and the anonymous. That dual perspective made her uniquely qualified to identify threats that others might miss and to understand the full scope of what it meant to serve one's country. The janitor was gone, but her legacy lived on in every operation that succeeded because of the intelligence she had gathered, every life that was saved because of the network she had exposed, and every future operative who would benefit from the techniques and protocols she had developed during 3 years of invisible service. In the end, Maria realized that the most effective warriors are often those who fight in shadows, whose victories are never celebrated, and whose sacrifices are known only to the people they protect. Maria Santos had been one such warrior, and her story would forever remind those who knew it that heroism often wears the most humble disguises. The invisible war continues, fought by men and women whose names will never be known, whose stories will never be told, and whose victories will never be celebrated. But their service protects the freedom and security that allows others to live their lives in safety, never knowing how close danger came or who stood between them and catastrophe. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to miss these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.